Welcome students, this is Dr. Dulai. I'll be teaching the summer course in physiology. My goal is to help you with the lecture component by making these videos available to you so that you may have a perspective on what the information in that chapter is trying to relay to us. I will also give you hints and suggestions on doing better in this course, as well as highlighting areas of confusion that students in the past may have experienced, either overall or with particular topics. So let us not waste any more time and begin with Chapter 1. The chapter can be viewed both as a revision tool as well as learning about homeostasis, a very important component that has a theme throughout the entire book and our course. In my opinion, the chapter can be divided into 3 sections, and those are color-coded here. So section 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 should be revision. Section 1.4 to 1.8 talks about homeostasis and how that relates to physiology. And then finally 1.9 just talks about general principles of physiology that are relevant to everything else that we will learn. Please remember the relationship between these 4 components of an organism. The workings of a cell and their interaction is very important in generating localized collections of tissue. And different tissues come together to form functional organs. But organs cannot work alone in most cases, so they are part of a system of interaction known as organ systems. If you dwell on the figure long enough, and this is my first piece of advice, pay very, very close attention to all the figures and tables and graphs in the textbook. Each one of them can be used to tell a story, and those stories become fodder for exam and quiz questions. Right here we can see that physiologists have classified cells into 4 basic specialized types: epithelial cells, connective tissue cells, neurons, and muscle cells. That's it. There's nothing else. So of the 210 different types of cells in the body, each one of them has to fall into one of these 4 buckets. That is amazing, but it's a fact. The first 2 are easy. And if you're a muscle cell, you'll fall into this bucket. If you are a nerve cell, you'll fall into this bucket. So all the other cell types in the body must fall into the remaining 2 buckets. Let us take a quick and precursory view inside the muscle bucket. Here we find that muscle cells in the human body are further subdivided into 3 subgroups: cardiac, skeletal, and smooth. That's it. So this one's easy. Only the heart is made of cardiac muscle cells. Therefore, skeletal muscles and smooth muscles must account for all the other types in the body. 2 out of the 3 are under involuntary control, and the third one is under voluntary control. So voluntary would be conscious control. So by consciously thinking about moving your arm, your skeletal muscles in your shoulder will be activated in a certain set of maneuvers to raise your arm according to your needs. Nervous tissue, or neurons, are cells that have evolved to message each other using electrical activity, as well as communicate those needs to muscles and glands, as we'll see in the future. Epithelial cells are cells which have become specialized to form barriers between one compartment or another, or to form a surface protective device surrounding a particular tissue or organ. One objective of learning would be for you to identify, either visually or through statements, the difference between different types of epithelial cells. An easy way to tell is their shape in cross-section. That is a slide showing these cells from the side. Some of them have a height that's proportional to their width, and those are called cuboidal. They're like a die. Some of them are longer than they are wider, and those are called columnar, elongated. And some of them are very short in height, but very squat, and those are called flattened or squamous. And some specialized locations contain tiny little hairs projecting from the surface of the cell itself, and those are called ciliated. So 1, 2, 3, 4 types of epithelial cells in terms of their shape have to be identified. In addition, populations of epithelial cells may exist as a single layer covering something, and we call that simple epithelium. Or they may consist of multiple layers stacked on top of each other, in which we call them stratified epithelial cells. The important thing is that form and function are intricately related through evolution. So epithelial cells in the trachea will have evolved for a purpose to help the trachea perform its function. The next area of understanding to do with epithelial cells is that they always rest on some type of extracellular matrix made of proteins and sugars called the basement membrane. And the basement membrane has a role in supplying nutrients to the epithelial cells as well as taking away waste. In addition, it acts as an anchor to keep those cells in place. With respect to simple epithelial cells, the side of the cell that actually faces the environment or the inside of a tube is called the apical surface. The apical surface. It's away from the basement membrane. The side of the cell that rests on the basement membrane directly is called the basal side or the basal side. And the side walls of the cell are called the lateral walls. So if we go to the next figure here, we can use this diagram to help us understand that. So here's the basement membrane in blue. The cuboidal cells here are sitting on the basement membrane. So this area here in brown must be the basal surface of the cell. This is the apical surface of the cell, and this and all the way around the cylinder would be the lateral surfaces. So they may have different composition when it comes to the membrane of this one cell, and that's repeated all the way along the other cells. In addition to resting on the basement membrane, the cells are further stabilized along their necks using specialized proteins that bring their membranes tightly together, called tight junctions. So in this diagram here, the tight junctions are right here represented by these brown blocks. The tight junction could be here or up here, depending on the function of that particular epithelial cell layer. We'll see them in various places. Thus, familiarity with this diagram is very, very paramount. If you can understand every aspect of this diagram, then you're in a position to move forward. Finally, we reach the fourth bucket, and the fourth bucket has everything else left over. So not muscle cells, not nerve cells, and not epithelial cells. So all the other types of cells, including blood, bone, and fat cells, as well as loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue, and soft bone, cartilage, are all placed together in this bucket, which seems an anomaly, but that's what it is. So what does connective tissue do? Well, it connects things together. It connects epithelial cells to something else, or it connects muscle cells to something else. In the process, connections can be used for anchoring things and supporting things. So the body uses connective tissue in huge amounts in various places. We'll be looking at how cells work throughout this book, but let's take a journey beyond the cell. Let's look outside cells. So what surrounds cells? Well, imagine you're a cell and you have neighboring cells close by, but there's still a small gap between you and your neighbor. And the question is, what's that gap called? Well, the name of that gap depends on what you're looking at. So if it's a fluid, it's going to be called extracellular fluid, outside the cell fluid. And if it contains a more solid structure, then it may be also called extracellular matrix. And the matrix can contain proteins, sugars, and minerals that are important in regulating that environment. What is known about the function of that environment, the extracellular matrix? Well, the answer is that it provides a solid scaffold for attaching that tissue or cells, and it also transmits information. And this is one of the most important aspects here. it carries information that then influences the behavior of that cell. So going back to your example, if you're the cell, then the air around you will be similar to the extracellular matrix, and that air will influence and control your behavior. The matrix can further be subdivided into fibrous structures or non-fibrous structures. So fibrous structures would be something you're familiar with, collagen. You may not be familiar with elastin, but those two are proteins that are present in different proportions inside various extracellular environments. In other places, there may not be any collagen or elastin fibers, and therefore we call that non-fibrous extracellular material, and that normally consists of sugars and proteins in some combination. Organs are defined as structures which are composed of two or more of the four types of tissue. For example, as it says here, blood vessels have layers of smooth muscle cells on the inside with endothelial cells facing the blood, as well as within the blood they have fibroblasts. Organ systems come into their own when one organ is relying on another organ to complete its function. So they're working together to perform some universal function for the human being. And the example they give here is that the kidneys cannot work alone, but they do work in collaboration with the bladder and the tubes that connect those regions to the outside of the body, therefore completing an organ system, in this case the urinary system. In fact, how many organ systems are there? Well, the next table, table 1.1, suggests there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 for us to learn. So throughout all the chapters of this book, we'll be learning all 11 of these organ systems in some combination. As far as this table is concerned, yes, you could be tested on any one of these columns in any combination. So you need to learn right away what the reproductive system entails and what its primary physiological function is. You should be familiar with most of this regardless. One area of confusion that students have demonstrated in the past is relating to the fluid component of the body, the fluid compartments. So what is the definition of body fluid? Well, the definition is that it's the watery solution of dissolved substances present in the body. That's it. Now, this fluid can be present either inside cells or outside cells. And then depending on its location, it can be further divided into subsections. And that's exactly what's happening here. So let's focus on the fluid outside the cells, extracellular fluid, and this fluid is very important. It is, however, divided into two subcompartments, and they should be pretty easy to understand. The first is blood itself. We consider the liquid part of blood to be plasma. So when somebody talks about plasma, they're talking about the watery component of blood. And of all the extracellular fluid that you have, about 20 to 25% is the plasma in your blood vessels. The remaining 75 to 80% of the fluid, the majority, 3/4, that's not present in your blood, but it lies between your cells and the blood vessels. So that's going to be the fluid bathing the cells, and that's called interstitial fluid. Interstitial. Stitial means cells, inter means between cells. So this is interstitial fluid. Now, the other name that throws students off is interstitium. It's the same thing as saying interstitial fluid. So that's the reference to that location. The space containing interstitial fluid is called interstitium. So, put both of these components together, the total volume of extracellular fluid comprises the blood plasma and the interstitial fluid. And totally, that adds up to 100%. Wait, there's more. We haven't finished yet. We've just spoken about fluid outside the cells. How about the fluid inside the cells? Well, the human body has between 30 and 100 trillion cells. So you're packed full of cells. And each cell has its own fluid component, a large fluid component, up to 90%. So that fluid can account for the majority of fluid in your body, believe it or not. In fact, 2/3 of the fluid in your body is found inside cells. Only 1/3 is found outside cells. That would be extracellular fluid. So the 67% of fluid inside cells has a name. It's called intracellular fluid, inside cells. Now, the composition of the two fluids, the extracellular and the intracellular, can be very different. In fact, cells spend a lot of energy maintaining the composition of their intracellular fluid to the needs of that particular cell. So you can imagine a fat cell doesn't have much in terms of intracellular fluid because it's mostly full of fat. Therefore, it tries to exclude extra fluid from coming in so it can do its job. This figure here can be used to revise all that knowledge. So you should be able to explain what's going on here, and then from this diagram come up with the generation of this relationship between the different compartments and how much fluid they contain. So try to remember these numbers, please. It's one of the few numbers that you have to remember in this course. So let's move on to the all-important learning objective of Chapter 1, which is to understand homeostasis. Homeostasis. Homeostasis is an important concept for students to be able to relate to on a constant basis throughout every chapter of this book. So what is homeostasis? Homeostasis is an active process which can use up to 2/3 of your calories every day to maintain your body's functions and chemical composition. So, as it says here, most physiological variables, such as blood pressure, body temperature, and blood gases, are maintained within a predictable range. So that's what homeostasis means. It doesn't mean exact value, it means a predictable range to do with your wellness at that time. So we do know that body temperature fluctuates between daytime and nighttime. So during the day you're warmer and at night you're cooler. So homeostasis is responsible for detecting whether it's daytime or nighttime and then adjusting your body temperature to a new value according to the 24-hour clock. So these physiological variables, these parameters, they can change quite drastically in some cases over a course of a full day. But your body is still not out of balance at night compared to the daytime because that's part of homeostasis. So the greatest challenge to students is to understand this terminology here, dynamic constancy. It seems to be a contradiction. Dynamic means movement, constancy means staying the same. But if you put that into the context of homeostasis, overall your body maintains a consistent range of parameters. But during the process of time, those parameters can be adjusted to suit your particular needs at that time. So that's what we have. So when homeostasis is maintained, we refer to that as physiology. When homeostasis cannot be maintained, then that person is experiencing pathophysiology or diseased physiology. A fantastic example to illustrate this dynamic constancy is to look at blood sugar concentrations. So this is the level of glucose in the blood over a typical 24-hour period with a person consuming 3 meals in a day. So you can see here, during the nighttime, the level of glucose in the blood begins to diminish because the person's asleep and hasn't eaten anything. Following breakfast, there's a rapid increase in blood sugar levels, so a new level is maintained, and that level is then brought back down quickly by the body to the set value and maintain that until the next meal, and the same thing happens until the third meal. But after the third meal, you can see that the blood sugar levels are reset to a slightly higher value and then maintained at that as before, with a slight decrease overnight. So this is dynamic constancy in work over a period of time. Before we dive into the relevance of this particular example, I'd like to draw your attention to a general standard that the textbook uses when it talks about physiological functions and processes. So arrows are used to connect different parameters together, and that should be read by you as this decrease leads to this increase. And this increase leads to this decrease. This decrease causes this, at the same time it causes this, and at the same time it causes this. So therefore, we get a flow of information where we have a domino effect from one thing taking place to another. Now, one thing you want to learn is, why are these boxes green and why are these boxes purple? And are there any other colors used throughout the book? But we'll come back to that in a few moments. But let's look at this example. This example is looking at temperature and no longer looking at blood glucose levels. So here, what it's saying is, begin here, and as the room temperature falls, so that would be the stimulus, your body has the following response. It will experience a loss of heat. The body temperature, therefore, will drop, and the body will respond by doing one of these three things, depending on the degree to which the body temperature has dropped. So the first thing is, you get a constriction of skin blood vessels, so that blood is taken away from the surface and kept in the core of your body. That makes sense. If the surface is too cold, why do you want to send more blood there to lose more heat? So that's logical. The second thing is, you will reduce surface area by wishing to curl up, therefore reducing your surface area that's in contact with the cold air of the room. And then finally, if neither of one of these two works, then you may start shivering to generate internal heat from muscle activity. Regardless, depending on which of these is the most paramount, you will then achieve either a reduction in the loss of body heat, or in addition, a production in the amount of heat produced by the body. Therefore, the body temperature will tend to be going towards its normal value. But this process can only be kept up so long. If you trap yourself in the freezer, it doesn't matter how much shivering you do. If the freezer is cooler than or more powerful than your ability to generate heat, you will slowly lose heat and then reach hypothermia. I'm sorry that I took so long in explaining a single diagram, but guess what? This is exactly what you need to do to succeed in this course. You have to dwell on every piece of information. If you don't, you won't be able to explain it to yourself, let alone somebody else like me or the TAs, and that will make you obtain smaller grades. So the next component of homeostasis, other than dynamic stability, is the mechanisms that the body employs to detect and respond. And we call those feedback loops or feedback systems. And there's three that you have to learn. The first one, number 2 here, is the most obvious. It's the most logical. So it's called negative feedback. So as your temperature increases because of increased external conditions, you will then start sweating in order to reduce your temperature. So your body is trying to regain control over your temperature and bring it back down to the value that it was before you started sweating. So return to normal would be the opposite direction from which the environment wants to change things. If you have a meal of lots of sugar, that will increase your blood sugar levels, and your body will do its utmost best to bring those blood sugar levels back to the original value by moving them in the opposite direction. So negative feedback is very common in physiology. Although there are many examples of positive feedback, students have a hard time relating to this. So let's give you a quick example, and then we'll explain what this sentence means. Suppose that you are a female and you're about to deliver a baby. So the relationship between the muscles in the uterus pushing is directly proportional to the diameter of the birth canal. So as the baby's head enters the birth canal, that's detected by stretch receptors. Information is sent to the brain, and the brain responds by contracting the muscles of the uterus so that the baby is pushed further into the birth canal, causing the muscles to stretch even further. And that stretch is relayed to the brain, which pushes back further and further, right? So eventually, the size of the birth canal is appropriate to deliver the baby. So that's positive feedback. So what's happening there is that the system enhances the effect of the birth canal by causing it to become larger and larger up to a certain point. So you're moving away from the set value. The set value is the diameter of the birth canal when there's no baby present, and during birth, the size of that birth canal will be expanded until baby is delivered. And then everything will reset. So with respect to the figures in the textbook, you'll see dotted lines indicating where one system, or the product of one system, or the outcome of one system, has a feedback effect on something else. So in this case, suppose you have sugar in the blood, and that sugar has been broken down into other biochemical intermediaries. The final product of the sugar breakdown, in this case it could be pyruvate, the buildup of that will have a negative effect on enzyme A, which breaks down further glucose. So this pathway will self-regulate itself. So in this case, we have another example of negative feedback where the production line is controlling itself, so you're not utilizing a lot of this or producing a lot of the end product. So this analogy that I normally give is of a car factory where the finished cars are piling up in the car park. Nobody's buying the cars. So the manager there looks at the car park and says, okay, stop production until we sell further cars. So no more cars are produced in the factory. So try to remember that as a negative feedback. Now what I would like you to do is to practice the same thing with positive feedback. What would happen in that case? The textbook authors warn us that there is not one or two or three feedback systems at work at the same time during homeostatic control. There may be hundreds of these systems, each one monitoring its own particular parameter or set of parameters. So what happens? Well, each of these feedback systems has a priority in the body. And the one that's most important gets the most priority to be controlled. And if it has some negative effects on subordinate systems, so be it. So for instance, in the lecture room, the temperature of the room should be very important to me, and I will set it at my particular setting, and I won't worry too much about the TAs or the students because you guys are not as important as me. So the words to look for here in terms of homeostatic control are reset. That's when the system changes the value. For instance, during nighttime when you're sleeping, your body temperature is lower. Then in the morning it's reset to the slightly higher temperature. So reset can happen, right? The set point is the value that your body wants to maintain within a narrow range. So that could be the concentration of blood glucose. So the set point is the value at which the system will want to maintain that. Now, it won't react immediately if the value is violated. It'll have a small buffer, just like your AC in the room doesn't come on immediately. The temperature changes by a fraction of a degree from the set value. It waits for a couple of degrees before it kicks in the heater or the AC. So this reiterates that negative feedback moves in the opposite direction, and that your body normally operates within very narrow ranges when it comes to homeostasis. One way to look at homeostasis is that it's a reflex mechanism. So we all are familiar with reflex. Reflex is when something triggers you to respond in a certain way. So reflexes are bigger than just homeostasis. A reflex is a specific, involuntary, unpremeditated, built-in response to a stimulus. So built-in means innate. Unpremeditated means it doesn't have to be learned. And involuntary means you don't have to think about it. So knee-jerk reaction, if somebody hits you on the knee, your knee will jerk under all these conditions. The stimulus in that case is the hammer hitting your knee, and the response is your muscle pulling back on your lower leg, causing it to jerk. So here's another one. This behavior is built into everybody, including babies. They don't have to learn this. It's instinctive. Examining reflexes at a deeper level, we see that as far as physiology is concerned, there are a number of components built into that system. So the stimulus would be the trigger, in this case the hammer. The receptor would be the cells in the skin next to the knee that detect the presence of the hammer, and other cells deeper down in the tissue that respond also. The afferent pathway is the nervous system carrying information A towards the central nervous system, to your spinal cord. We'll learn more about this later. The integrating center is the computer that determines what course of action to take. In this case, it'll be in your spinal cord, which just turns the signal back around. The effector is the pathway that carries the information away from the central nervous system, i.e. from your spinal cord back to the muscles in your leg. And the effectors here would be your muscles in the leg that cause your knee to jerk. So this may seem complex, but each one of these components we're going to discuss throughout the course as important response or pathways or mechanisms of information integration. Putting all that information in the form of a diagram, we can generate this U-shaped or N-shaped diagram with the beginning here where the hammer hits the knee responds, that information is sent through nerves to the central nervous system, and then other nerves carry information back to the muscles in the leg, and then you get that knee jerk. In many cases, right, the response here is to counteract the stimulus. So the hammer is pushing on a tendon, and the response is to shorten that tendon back to its original condition. Here is a similar diagram to address the example of temperature changes happening in the body. In this case, we're going to look at a decrease in body temperature and how the body responds. So we begin here, and you can see what's happening, a decrease in body temperature. Then the receptors, they detect that decreased body temperature. They send information to the integrating center, wherever that may be. In this case, it's in the brain. And then the brain responds by sending signals back out through the afferent pathway to the muscles, both to the smooth muscles in the blood vessels and to the skeletal muscles in various parts of your body. So here we have a constriction of blood flow to the skin surface, resulting in less loss of heat physically. And here we have the generation of heat through shivering. Both of them counteract the decrease in body temperature, so these would have a negative feedback on decreased body temperature, and that's why you see the negative sign right there. Research in physiology has shown that almost every cell in the body can act as an effector when it comes to homeostatic reflexes. So effectors, they carry out the wishes of the body. Now, muscles and glands are the major effectors or biological control systems, right? So in most cases, when some response is needed, it's going to be performed by either the muscles or the glands or a combination thereof. Now, glands can be both a receptor and an integrating center, and we'll learn that when we get to those particular locations. Some glands secrete hormones directly into the blood, and those hormones act as effectors on other cells in various parts of the body. So what is a hormone? Well, there's a definition here. A hormone is a chemical messenger that's secreted into the blood by cells of the endocrine system. And we'll learn about the endocrine system subsequently. Now, these hormones may act on many different cells simultaneously because they are present throughout the entire body at various levels. So some cells will respond to this chemical, other cells will ignore it. The term hormone has to be refined because we have other substances that act over much shorter distances, therefore they don't travel long distances in the blood. So hormones, by definition, do travel long distances in the blood, and they're pretty stable. They have a relatively long life expectancy. Whereas neurotransmitters are substances, chemical messengers, that are released, but they don't last very long, or they are destroyed very quickly. They can only travel a very tiny distance, maybe from the end of one cell to the surface of a neighboring cell, which is right next door. The body has a limited supply of these chemicals, i.e. there's a certain variety of chemicals that can be made. So how do we perform all the thousands of different functions without having thousands of different chemicals, each talking to its own system? Well, the answer is that we piggyback certain things. So the same chemical may have different effects on different regions of the body, or different chemicals may be used as a neurotransmitter versus a hormone by being produced by different cells in different amounts, right? So here's an example. So a particular messenger may function as a neurotransmitter, a long-distance, long-lasting hormone, or something in between. And the something in between has been broken down into two subcategories. So students have to learn all four of these. So autocrine is the most localized effect. Here, the surface of the cell produces a chemical that affects itself. So here we have self-control. So this cell, a liver cell, may secrete something that changes the behavior of that liver cell. So we call those autocrine substances. Auto means self. If the effect is very local, very, very local, the release of that substance will cause only those cells that can receive the right concentration before that chemical disappears to respond. Then we have neurotransmitters. These are only effective at very close range on those cells that can receive the signal of the neurotransmitter. So one nerve to the next, one nerve to a muscle, one nerve to a gland. And then we have hormones, which we discussed before, very stable chemicals that can travel throughout the body, right? So cortisol is a chemical that can have differing effects in different parts of the body because of the way that it's perceived. To conclude the category of communication, there are two other types of communication that are quite common throughout the body. Gap junctions are simply holes in the cytoplasm of two neighboring cells. So if I'm a neighboring cell to somebody else, I may have an ulcer in my skin and the other person has an ulcer in their skin, and the fluid between our two bodies can cross-communicate through the ulcers. That's a bad example, but you get the idea. So gap junctions are present, for instance, between cardiac cells. So when the electrical activity in one cardiac cell is generated, it doesn't have to wait to cross over membranes to get to the next cardiac cell. It just dives through a tunnel between the two cells where the cytoplasm, the cytosol is connected, right? So that's one type of communication. Juxtacrine is where one cell has to touch another cell physically in order to convey information. So this is where the immune system comes into its part, or localized communication. A word of caution when to use these two words. Adaptation should only be used in the context of talking about populations and how the human species has evolved through adaptation. So adaptation is a population survival commodity. The more physiological use of the word is acclimatization. So for instance, if I start climbing a mountain and I live on top of the mountain, then my blood will generate more red blood cells and carry more oxygen because my body has become acclimatized to living at high altitude. So this is a physiological use of the word, and this is an evolutionary use of the word. Please don't intermingle the two words. Because homeostasis involves dynamic constancy, we also find that we have rhythms to our bodies that are entrained through lifestyle and other factors. So what we're realizing is that more and more of our body has rhythms that we haven't detected in the past. So the most common rhythm we have is the circadian rhythm, which is our 24-hour clock. This clock tells us when to sleep and when to wake, but in addition, it also affects many other aspects of our body, including our body temperature, the presence or absence of digestive enzymes, sexual hormones, etc., etc. So waking and sleeping, body temperature, hormone concentrations in the blood, the exchange of ions in the urine are all examples of circadian variation, rhythmic variation. Not all of them run on 24-hour clocks. Some of them may run on 3-hour clocks, but they are still rhythms that the body uses to entrain itself. To support the claims I made very early in this video, here we have circadian rhythms to do with body temperature. So I told you that our body temperature is higher during the day and lower at night. And here it is. This is data from experimental observations of human physiology. So you can see the variation is tiny between 1 degree and 1.5 degrees Celsius, but still significant. So dwell on this figure, understand that. So we mentioned 2 types of feedback, but we told you there were 3 types. Positive feedback, negative feedback are the 2 types that we discussed earlier. This is the 3rd type. This is anticipation. It's called feed-forward because you're anticipating the future and your body prepares for the future at this time. For instance, if it's breakfast time and you know you have breakfast at 6 o'clock every morning and it's 5 o'clock in the morning right now, your body will start producing salivary enzyme and start stocking up your salivary glands, and your stomach will start changing the amount of acid it's producing in anticipation of you having a meal at 6 o'clock. So this is what we call feed-forward systems. Very important. And these can be linked directly to biological rhythms and homeostasis. So once again, make sure you understand the difference between all 3 types of feedback. Although some systems work on absolute values, absolute physical values, most of your physiology is based on relative values. So relatively, you may have extra salt in your body. Then, depending on your lifestyle, if you continue to eat high salt food, your body will maintain a high level of salt and adjust your water levels accordingly. But if you go on a diet and reduce the amount of salt that you eat, then your body will have less salt, but it will still continue to operate around the value of salt that you have by adjusting the water levels accordingly. So the body can be considered a reservoir of that chemical or that substance. So if you continue to put more of that substance into your body, the body will react in a way to first eliminate the extra, but then adjust to the new value. So the number of fat cells on your body when you were thin were limited, but when you gain weight, they become more profound. But your body then settles down at that new weight, depending on your lifestyle, right? So this reservoir concept is very important, and we call that the Paul concentration, the concentration of that parameter inside your body. So based on lots of physiology and the way that things work, physics comes into play, right? So negative balance is when you lose the substance faster than you gain it, so you'll have a decrease. A positive balance is when you gain that substance faster than you lose it. And of course, stable balance is a nice balance between gain and loss. So keep that in mind, but that's very important. We'll learn a lot more about that later. Here is a very generic overview of chemical substances in the body. You can see the pool. That pool can be in various places. It doesn't have to be localized to one place. It could be in the blood, or it could be in the bone, whatever. Here it is. Here's a pool of substances, and you can send that substance back and forth between storage places, or you can convert it to other substances, or you can get rid of it from the body through the extremities like sweat glands, kidneys, skin, and lungs, or you can metabolize it to something else as well. And then, of course, you can gain it through various means. Some comes through the food, others may come through the air or combination thereof, and some may be made by the body from other raw materials. Some could be injected into the body. But I think you get the idea, right? The important thing is how much of it exists in the pool and what other devices are available to the body to make adjustments to that pool. The final section of Chapter 1 is simply a summary of some of the essentials of homeostasis, and to just put that in perspective with your total body systems. So one thing we learn is that without homeostasis, you have pathophysiology. You have disease, ill health, and maybe death. So homeostasis is essential to your health and survival. We also learned that organs talk to each other. They communicate through hormones, or through paracrine substances, or through nerves and other means, right? So coordination in the body is vital to make sure that different systems have different priorities and have different controls. Now, the word control is very important, and we're going to learn a lot about how things are controlled. But one thing we do know, there are multiple overlapping systems with different priorities, and some systems counteract other systems, so they may work in opposition. But overall, one system at that point in time will be paramount, and it will be given priority over other systems as much as possible. And of course, the most important thing is that we're made of cells and organs and tissues. And if there's no communication between those entities, then there's no adjustment possible. So information flow is vital for cells to learn about their environment and then to respond accordingly. The next thing that we need to understand, that there's a pool of material inside the cell, and that pool exists both within cells and without cells, right? Inside and outside cells. So I will give you examples of that later. This is a hard concept. But the paramount thing is the laws of biology, the laws of physics, and the laws of chemistry all work together. But physics has the most priority. Then the laws of chemistry come into play within the realm of physics. And then finally, biological laws have to obey both the laws of physics and the laws of chemistry. And then physiology operates within the biological laws. So you can't violate the laws of physics or chemistry, right? You can't invent new elements. You can't violate the use of energy. So your body is tightly tied to the environment in which we live. Now, physiological processes require transfer of matter and energy. If you put these two together, what do you get? You get food. That's what food is. Food supplies energy and it contains atoms of matter. So what happens when you go to the bathroom? Well, you lose matter and you may lose some energy. So that's important. So energy in, energy out, right? And lastly here we have, the relationship between anatomy and physiology. So anatomy gives you the structure, and physiology then puts in the function for that structure. So the two work together. Every now and again, the authors have included a clinical case study just to keep us on our toes and relating to human health. So these examples are based on scenarios that one may have come across as a physiology student. Try to pick a long, suitable answer, and we can discuss these in class. And then finally, we have an example of heat stroke, and this refers back to this clinical study. So this is a clue as to what's happening with this case study. So if you get lost here, have a look at the solution on the next slide. So that's it for now. I'm going to get ready to prepare the next lecture. So thanks for listening, and hopefully this helped you some.